Hey everyone, I just wanted to share with you a little bit of additional information about chapter 2. So, this is the second lecture section of that chapter, just to give you some more detailed information that may or may not help you with your discussion question this week, but hopefully it will. So, again, the learning chapter or the learning outcome of the chapter is this. We really want to focus on our decision making when determining all the things to measure targets and assessments for the classroom. And so I want you to think about this quote for just a minute because I think it's a really important one. And if you are not familiar with Dr. John Hattie, he's someone in the education world that is very prevalent. He's done decades and decades of research on what makes teaching and instruction and learning effective. And so this quote says, highly effective teachers engage in deliberate decision making resulting from the specific ways they think about teaching and learning. So we really want to think about assessment in terms of deliberate decision making. And so we're going to look at the what, the why, and the how. But first, we always want to focus on the why. And the text addresses this, but I wanted to put it into some simpler terms that I think may help you. And so we have formative or informal, right? You're going to read about that in the Tomlinson article. Hopefully you read about that in chapter 1, but you're going to need to refer back to that here in module 2, chapter 2, so that you have a better understanding of how to address your discussion question. But we have formative or informal versus summative formal assessments. So when we're thinking about these two terms, we really want to think about formative assessments until that I am really able to find the gaps in where student learning occurs, right? What they already bring to the table, like what are the assets students already bring, and then where are the gaps? And I want to close those gaps as much as possible through the lens of formative or informal assessments before I get to the summative assessment, so that not only you as a teacher are winning the race, but definitely, right, your kids are winning the race of not just grade wise, but mastery over our state standards, the TEKS. And so think about this through the lens of a coach, right? If you've ever been an athlete or you're planning on being a coach, coaches study and diagnose, and they target minor changes for big impact. So they review film frequently, right? Like they have somebody coaching them. And so if we view teaching more like a coach versus sometimes kind of that and there's a lot that goes into teaching, right? Like as far as behavioral and management pieces go. But really, when we're talking about learning, we want to diagnose as much as possible as a coach. And so I think that's really important to think about as we think in terms of assessment. And so again, the why, the importance of assessments is to diagnose student learning. And so we want to identify the problem, the misconceptions, the flaws in reasoning or incomplete understanding. So that can also come through the form of a pre-assessment. So as we're looking at our units, once we learn our curriculum in a new district as a whole or as our student teaching and we're looking at units, it's important to talk about what could we possibly pre-assess to really diagnose where students currently are, what they already bring to the table in terms of background knowledge, and where the gaps are. And sometimes we find that it's not that we skip over TEKS ever, but sometimes we can spend less time on a certain standard than other standards, and it saves us time because we know that in the education world, our greatest asset and also greatest enemy is time, right? And so we hear people complain about that frequently, no matter what profession or what life stage they're in, it's about time. So if we can already kind of diagnose the problem ahead of time, and through maybe a pre-assessment or at least on a daily basis, which we'll get into more later, that's really critical. We also a pre-assessment and also the importance of like formative or informal assessments is they allow penalty-free practice before you get to that larger summative or more formal assessment. And a formal assessment, I often say, and we'll see this again in a minute, is more of a autopsy. And so by the time you get to the autopsy, right, like you haven't the diagnosis is moot. I mean, the point is over. So if you get to that autopsy type of summative before the kids have a chance to practice penalty free, or at least with minor grades, then we never get to diagnose as much as we could have. And then we have these major shocks and surprises when we get to those summative assessments. And so we also, if the importance of assessments gives us a chance to reteach when needed. So specifically here, we're talking about those informal or formative assessments. We want to reteach when needed. We also want to provide intervention and enrichment opportunities based on diagnostic data. And then we want to provide valuable feedback students can use before that formal summative assessment is conducted. So the last piece of the why is data really tells us the real story, right? If we don't have the data, we don't really have anything to support what's happening. And then inferences are made off of the data. So then you can pivot your instruction and plan accordingly. So really, I hear teachers say a lot, like, how does this impact my daily instruction? So if we wait till the summative assessment, it's very hard to backtrack, right? And so because time is of the essence and we have things to carry out per each unit and per each grading period. So it's really important that we know along the way before we get to that final formal or summative assessment that we really know what the data is really telling us, so we can diagnose along the way and make adjustments so that kids can be successful on that summative assessment. So now we're going to quickly talk about the what, and this is covered in the text as well. I'm just putting it into a more kind of, usable terms so that when you get into the classroom, it's very practical information. And so what do we actually need to assess, right? Well, first and foremost, we need to assess the state standards, which are the TEKS. And I know the text covers the Common Core, which Texas is not using. We use the Texas College and Career Readiness Standards, which you may or may not be familiar with, but we do not address the Common Core. But we do have a lot of similarities to the Common Core, but it's very important that we understand our TEKS. And we're also planning backwards, right, from the main unit or the grading period. So if we look at a unit at hand, and eventually when you get into a school district or you student teach, you will see a scope and sequence or some sort of guide that helps you understand what the unit looks like as a whole. Like, what's the overall objectives of the unit? And you can look at the summative or that formal assessment, and you can start planning backwards, right? So all of your lesson plans should align to that culminating task or that summative task or assignment or assessment that students have to do. And so if I'm not ensuring that every lesson plan and every other assignment aligns to that summative assessment at the end, then I'm not doing my students justice as much as I could, right? And I'm not serving them as well as I could. And also, I'm not having clarity around what I need to teach. And that's really important as a teacher so that you're not feeling frustrated at the end of a grading period or when a major assignment or assessment comes, and you can really know where kids are along the way. So you're planning your lesson plans accordingly, and you're ensuring that all the TEKS align and that all the criteria aligns along the way. And then again, that diagnosis versus autopsy. We don't want to get to that autopsy portion of a summative assessment and not have a diagnosis along the way that helps us, before we get to that critical point of a summative or a formal assessment. We want to know where kids are every step of the way. And then we're going to look at the how. And so assessments are effective when they are aligned, right, to the objective. And the text talks about objectives and different terms that we can use in place of objective. And we want to assess the current knowledge and skills that are coming from the TEKS. It's also rigorous based on the TEKS. It requires the critical thinking necessary for success in college and a career. And then we also want our assessments to be scaffolded, which allows the teacher to identify if and where the learning is breaking down. So whether I'm giving a multiple choice question or a selective response question, which is the multiple choice, or a short constructed response where they fill in the blank, or they write a very short sentence or two, or an extended constructive response where they're writing a paragraph or more, I really want to be able to tell what that diagnosis. So I have already anticipated student responses. I've created some exemplars that help me as a teacher understand if the question is answerable, because sometimes working with teachers, I find that teachers cannot answer the questions that they have created or that have been given to them from another source. And so it's very critical that we know that we can answer the questions, because if we can't answer the questions well, then the students certainly cannot answer them either, and we need to know the criteria that goes along with those. And so assessments are effective when the TEKS are, right, assessed in a variety of ways, which the text covers. Your text covers selected responses, which is multiple choice, true, false, etc., short constructive responses, extended constructive responses, or essays. The learning objectives are based on the TEKS. They're measurable within a time period given. They ensure that informal and formal data can be collected daily. So that might mean I'm just walking around, I'm collecting observational data, I'm collecting exit tickets at the end of the class based on the daily objective, based on the TEKS, things like that. I'm also reducing ambiguity by having clear success criteria. So later on in this course, you will have this opportunity to create some of that success criteria, and also create a student self-assessment that will be for extra credit, which can also help you once you get into the classroom immediately. Okay. And then we also want to ensure that our learning objectives are based on the rigor of the TEKS by using the Bloom's taxonomy and depth of knowledge, which is covered more in your text. And so we also want to pay attention to, again, in the text, it covers our assessment blueprint. When I say curriculum conception, what I mean here is we want to be pretty decent consumers of our curriculum by ensuring that every lesson, even though it may be given to us in a curriculum resource, we want to ensure that we understand the TEKS at the level that we need to as a powerful instructor of students, and that we look through our lessons and we become better evaluators to determine what tweaks or customizations we need to make to those lessons. And then we also want to pay attention to our district and campus scope and sequence of curriculum. And a scope and sequence, very simply put, is just the timeline that we need to teach a certain TEK or TEKS set of TEKS together that may be bundled. And so we want to be better evaluators of that. And then we also want to look at our district and campus provided assessments. A lot of districts will go ahead and provide those assessments, but we want to ensure that they are aligned to the TEKS. And especially with the redesign, there's been a lot of redesigns to our STAR state assessment. And so sometimes in districts right now, they're still realigning their grade period assessments or unit assessments to reflect the changes that have been made to the state assessment. And then we also want to acknowledge, and you will later on this course look at this, that our TEKS are divided into strands or reporting categories, which means that there are a variety of different categories that the TEKS may entail, and then there's TEKS bundled with those categories. For example, if I'm an English language arts teacher, one of the TEKS is foundational literacy skills, which include like oral skills like phonics, if I'm in the lower grades and things like that, or vocabulary. It could also incorporate our author's craft and purpose, which includes a lot of our reading and writing reciprocity stands. And then there's things like our process standards in math, science, and social studies, which really entail things like justification and reasoning and using equipment and things like that. And so all of those are really important as we're thinking about assessment and how we might assess those things, because sometimes we have to get a little creative. It really goes beyond the multiple choice, question. And so Page 62 in the text gives a collection of what to assess considerations, and they're really good considerations, so please pay particular attention to that. And then lastly, the text mentions this, but I wanted to show you kind of a real live picture of, sometimes it's really hard to see the forest, through all the trees, right? And see kind of those beautiful views that we often sometimes miss because things are obscuring our view. And so we want to ensure that we are really analyzing everything that we do through the lens of our state standards, which are the TEKS, so that we can be better consumers of our curriculum materials, better consumers of the assessments that we choose, or that we are kind of told to give to students, so that we can raise the questions that need to be raised so that ultimate student achievement can be reached. And then we're also able to change our instruction accordingly and be really good instructors and teachers for students. So I hope that if you need any